Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon and welcome to our Espresso with the Expert webinar on data privacy with our innovation partner, Kainos. We're excited that you're able to join us today. This webinar is designed to be a midday coffee break where our experts answer all of the questions that you submitted. We've gathered those in advance, and Kristen and Phil will spend the next 30 minutes providing those answers. If you have any additional questions throughout the presentation, please submit those via the Q&A feature and we'll take time to answer them at the end. With that, I'll pass it over to Kristen and Phil to get us started.
All right. Hi, everyone. So Kristen Kelly here. I am our learning practice lead here at Intecrowd. I also am leading our change management and training team. So excited to be here and talking to you all about data privacy and how the tool can help you all if needed, and also some other best practices when just considering any PII and ensuring we are keeping our employee data safe. Phil?
Thanks, Kristen. Hey, everybody. It's great to be joining you again. My name is Phil Norton. I work at Kainos as a product solution consultant. I specialize in our automated suite of products that you possibly have heard of. And more recently, I've been working very closely with our teams on our data masking solution, which is, I think, a timely conversation we're going to have today, Kristen, in terms of some of the questions that have been asked. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to getting into the questions and talking further.
All right, so what we're seeing here is these are the questions that we will be covering. Phil and I will be tag teaming some of these questions, going back and forth. And we just want to take a moment. I'm not going to read the 4 questions out because we'll be reading them as we get into the questions, but just giving you a few seconds to take a look at the questions submitted. That way, if you do have any additional questions that if we have time at the end of the call you would like us to cover, that you don't see here, please feel free to submit those and we'll get to them at the end or as a follow-up. With that, we're going to go ahead and jump straight in. So first question we have is, how do we know what information would be classified as PII within Workday? So to kind of kick us off with, how do we classify what is PII? I'm going to talk about PII, personal identifiable information, right, is defined as information that directly identifies an individual. So this, you can see some examples here: name, address, social security number, even part of a social security number. There are some other items that you're seeing on the screen. And so it's a combination of 2 or more of those pieces of information that are sent that can identify a person either directly or indirectly. So this individual information can be used, but understand what name, contact information. If you send that at one time, that is becoming PII because you're now sending 2 pieces of what we consider personal identifiable information in one communication. So now it is PII. I will give you, just as a best practice before I turn it over to Phil to kind of talk through some of the other items here, is what we do in a crowd, right? When you're working with us on AMS cases, the first thing we always talk to our clients about is when we are working on cases, we ask that instead of you even sending over the employee's name, to only ever provide us the employee ID, because we are able to access, make sure we're seeing the right person. So if there's multiple people with that name, the employee ID is the safest way to do that. And again, by only providing employee ID, it is not considered PII because it is just one piece. If you send name and employee ID, that could be considered and is considered in our case personal identifiable information. So that's kind of what we look at as PII and how we take a look at it from what we're doing on our AMS side and on our projects. So we always are just talking about employee IDs. But Phil, anything to add here, or would you like to talk about any of the other examples?
I think what I would probably add would be what's really easy to think about are some of the obvious ones on the screen. Kristen, you talked about social security number, date of birth, things like that. I think one thing to point out is that Workday as a platform is containing more and more sensitive information. So there's things on here that are probably more prevalent these days than ever before. Things like gender identity, anything around diversity and inclusion. So it's really important to make sure that that's also something you take into consideration, not only from when you send this out, but also making sure that you secure it appropriately within Workday itself. Make sure that only the relevant people have access to the relevant data, and that's something you take very seriously within the tenant. And that will probably just be the only thing I would add to that, Kristen.
No, that's good. So here we go. So we are currently scrambling data on a project tenant. What are the different impacts between data scrambling and data masking? And Phil, I'm going to turn it straight over to you on this one.
No worries. Thank you so much. So I guess before I talk about the impacts, let's talk about what the differences are. So Workday do have a couple of native options that you can make use of. One is called scrambling, and one is called masking. Scrambling is, I guess, a little bit like the name would suggest. It replaces sensitive worker data or any other data, for example, that matter, on your Workday tenant with essentially nonsensical data. So a name would be replaced with a collection of vowels and consonants, meaning that Phil Norton as a name ceases to be that and it becomes something very different in your Workday tenants. It can help when it comes to ensuring that if, for example, the Workday databases are hacked, this information is particularly useless. It can also be useful when it comes to maybe testing integrations or third-party systems you may have set up to feed data in or out of Workday, because obviously that would mean that you could scramble that information at source. It's important to note that it's a singular operation that takes place. So what that means is everybody will see the same scrambled data, but it is an option that quite a few Workday customers use. Masking is slightly different. Both of these techniques are designed to, I guess, perform the same overall task, which is to render the data viewed on screen as anonymized to a certain extent. Masking does it, though, at the presentational layer, not in the database. What that basically means is that it doesn't actually change the values at source. It changes them as they appear on screen. What you've probably seen this in action before is around things like payment election. So your bank account number, for example, will have a series of X's followed by the last 4 digits of your account number to help you understand exactly what that is. Well, in the database, that is not stored as a series of X's. What is happening is that is appearing on screen with Workday, and it's going to mask the first 4 characters or more of that particular number, just to give you a little sense of privacy there. If anyone happens to be sitting over your shoulder, that they won't be able to see that type of information itself. Now, when it comes to, I guess, the impacts of those, there's probably a number of things I'd want to point out just to make people fully aware. Scrambling as an option, as I said, can be very secure. It's going to take that information and irreversibly change it. One thing to bear in mind is that Workday don't make this available on Sandbox. So Sandbox is that one tenant that is going to have that refresh taking place every single weekend. They don't make it available on Sandbox, probably for a couple of good reasons. One is that this will actually destroy the data. What that means is that it takes time. There's an algorithm that's applied to your tenant, so the tenants have to go offline for that to happen. Given that Sandbox only lives for 7 days, they want you to have they want to maximize, the time that you have with that tenant and the data. The Sandbox is not an option. So if this is something you're considering in terms of protecting that data in Sandbox, it's not going to be an option. And there's still a couple of areas Workday are working on to apply their algorithms to. You'll see on screen, for example, performance, pay slips, and addresses are areas that aren't currently covered. I actually think from a testing perspective, changing the data doesn't add a lot of value. In fact, it can create more problems than it's worth. So when you're doing, I guess, anything in Workday, it's driven by data. If you're all of a sudden changing that data, so for example, any numerical values changing, that may make any condition rules based on numbers very difficult to trigger within Workday itself. So it's just something to bear in mind that whilst it can be seen as a very secure way of obfuscating data, it can also have its drawbacks. For me, masking is a preferable way to do this because the data integrity remains intact and Workday do have a solution. And the good news is that their masking solution does work on Sandbox as well as other implementation tenants. In fact, as I said, you'll also see it working on production. Now, one caveat with what Workday does with their masking is it is particularly limited in terms of what they can do. It's worker objects, for example, only. And you'll see things like bank account number, person, birthplace, person, date of birth. There's about 6 areas that Workday cover as part of their masking coverage. That doesn't mean it's 6 fields. Things like if we consider, for example, date of birth, that would include somebody's age, maybe years until retirement, any fields that might span from that. But ultimately, there's not a huge amount of things that can be masked. But there are two options that come natively from Workday. And really, the one that you might want to choose is dependent upon what it is you're looking to safeguard and on what tenant. Of course, I'm here from Kainos, and I can take you through what differentiates Smart Shield as an offering. But I just wanted to make it clear at this point in time, these are what the native Workday solutions are, so that you have I guess a little bit of context around those, and we can talk about Smart Shield a little bit later on.
Right. And next we need ways to have a broader team test business processes and release items without sharing confidential data with them, and need to train in tenant without exposing PII or compensation data during the sessions. So first, what I would say is when we are talking about testing within the tenant or training within the tenant, there are some things that you could do without scrambling the data, using a test tool, doing those sort of things. But one thing you could do inside the tenant yourself is, if it's to train in tenant, you could always set up, and we covered this quickly and briefly on our call last time on our last webinar, but you would be able to set up training supervisory organizations, and you could create as many or as few organizations that you need based on the training you are trying to do, right? So if you need to do manager training, then we're going to have at least 2 levels of organizations created. So you can create fake supervisory organizations with fake employees in those supervisory organizations that you can use to train in the tenant. It would not be for some of the others of not sharing confidential data or having people test VPs in as other individuals, which I will let Phil talk to. But I did just want to touch on, you do have the ability to train in the tenant by doing some of those things, as far as setting up fake supervisory organizations or hiring in a fake employee who you then perform the task as. So you can either do live trainings, or as you were screen recording or creating some of your training materials, you could then take screenshots to do that. And then Phil, I'm going to turn it over to you to add on here.
Yeah, no, Kristen, first off, that's a really strong suggestion that actually leveraging Workday itself as a platform to generate synthetic objects is a great way of doing training. In fact, we do embrace that within our own automated testing platform to enable us to do testing much more effectively. One thing I would point out, though, is that that whilst that can be a really good way of avoiding having to master or scramble, sometimes nothing beats using a real person as an example. If you're trying to use a synthetic fill for example, then there's a certain lack of context. So this is where I think actually using masking and in particular what we can do with Smart Shield, I think does add a lot of value. But you have to again remember that the tenants that you're going to be working on will contain real data. So as Kristen's just said, one way around that is to look at generating synthetic data. If you're not using automation to generate that, that might have a little bit of an overhead on a sandbox environment, because every week that's going to be refreshed from production. So you're not going to have that synthetic structure on your sandbox environment. Less of an issue on the implementation tenant. But ultimately what you've got with your Workday tenants is that you have the ability to leverage the production-like data in non-production tenants, but that comes with obviously the caveat that they will have sensitive data on them. The minute that your sandbox tenant is refreshed, for example, 100% of that data is live and real time. As that week goes on, obviously that tenant starts to drift away ever so slightly from your production tenant. So we estimate that probably about 75% to 100% of data on non-production tenants is real. But one of the real areas you need to consider when it comes to the non-production tenants, and whether this is training or testing, is access to the data itself. One great way of being able to train people through an overall process is to leverage proxy. Showcase exactly what an overall process looks like. So that can be really obviously handled with synthetic data, but you will come across instances where you can't necessarily have synthetic data for every single eventuality. And that's where you really want to make sure that you have the ability to provide additional controls, which is really where Smart Shield as a product in our automation suite was born out of. It was born out of recognizing that Workday has a world-class security model, recognizing that Workday proxy is perhaps one of its best features for project teams, but looking for ways to improve upon that while still ensuring that Workday remains the source of the security configuration itself. And what I'd like to do is showcase what I mean by that by showcasing a demo of what it looks like as, I guess, a training or testing exercise before we have something like data masking in place. This is Lillian Chu. She is one of our colleagues and she's on a non-production Workday tenant. This has been recently refreshed. What that basically means is when she's looking at Steve Morgan's profile, she's looking at pretty much up-to-date information. Now, because of the way Workday works, she has exactly the same permissions in Sandbox as she does in production. So she doesn't have access to this compensation. But Sandbox does allow her to proxy. What that means is she can now experience Workday through the eyes of somebody else. In this case, she's picked the VP of HR. So now when she goes back to look at Steve Morgan's profile, what you'll see here is that she's able to see not only the compensation tab, but all of the sub-tabs that exist therein. And because this tenant has been recently refreshed, this is all up-to-date information, so she knows exactly what his pay change history looks like up to the minute here. She has full oversight into that. And this is where, I guess, from a training and testing perspective, the fact that your tenants have that real data is usually a reason why people are a little wary of proxy and also are looking to leverage the creation of synthetic structures and workers to maybe bypass that. What we believe is that you can have the best of both worlds here with Smart Shield. You can still leverage the synthetic workers if that's something you want to do. But if you want to leverage real life people, real life configuration in your tenant, but mask it as and when you need to, then Smart Shield has the ability to do that. And what I want to show you is essentially a rerun of what we did, what we showed for Lillian there, only this time with Smart Shield in place. And this is going to show how we can protect the data even during a proxy session in your non-production tenants. So this is Smart Shield in place. Think of it as like an invisible layer on top of the Workday tenant. As far as Lillian's concerned, nothing has changed. But if your Zoom connection is good and you've got enough bandwidth, you might see this is a slightly different URL from a Workday URL. This is our Smart Shield gateway URL. This is what allows us to perform our dynamic masking in real time. What this means is when Lillian enters the proxy session, we know that she's in a proxy session. We know that we have a number of fields that we want to mask during that session, and we can do that dynamically and in real time. So now when she goes back to look at Steve Morgan's profile and his compensation, any of the fields that we've selected as part of our masking rule are masked dynamically and intelligently. What I mean by that is you'll see that the compensation action, for example, and reason have been masked as a series of X's. We recognize when we're displaying this on screen that these are text or date-bound fields. So what we're doing is we're rendering those as X's, but if it's a decimal, for example, a salary or a number, we're going to do that as a numeric value as well. What this basically means is Lillian is able to have a look at this screen through the eyes of Logan. She can prove, for example, that Logan can see this, or if she's doing training, she can take people through this particular screen without actually ever revealing the information that is there because it's protected by that dynamic masking. And this is not changing it in the database. This is where it's a very different experience from scrambling. What that means is if Logan logs in at the same time, or if Steve logs in at the same time to this particular non-production tenant, they will see the real data without being masked because this rule is purely intended for Lillian at a particular point in time. And that's I guess, a really good way of showcasing how we can leverage our automated masking to give you some more coverage when it comes to training and testing. But one thing that we've also done, and I think would be really useful to have a look at, is we've flipped the way that masking can be performed on its head. On average, in a Workday tenant, there's over 60,000 individual fields that exist. Knowing where to start with your masking journey can be quite difficult. In that example we've just showcased, we selected a number of compensation fields that we wanted to mask during that session. But when you're doing training, sometimes you don't necessarily know all of the things you want to mask. What you have a better understanding of is the things that you want to showcase during that particular training session itself. With 60,000 fields, the last thing we want to do is have you select 59,990 of those and leave 10 fields unmasked. So what we do instead is we allow you to flip the masking on its head, and we tell Smart Shield to mask everything by default on the Workday tenant, And that allows us to select the fields that we want to unmask, making it really simple for this to occur. And what that means is if you are doing training, as Maria is doing here, you can be safe that actually you're only ever going to reveal the data you need during this particular screen share. What you'll see is when she logs into the Workday tenant straight away and goes to a particular user, all of the information on that summary page is masked instantly. And we haven't had to select any of those fields. The default reaction of Smart Shield is to mask them by default. When we go to the area of training we care about, which is time off and leave, those information are visible. And if I happen to click in anywhere else during this particular session, Smart Shield has my back by protecting that information by default. And again, a really cool thing about this is you can choose the time and date that this occurs on. So if you know that Maria is doing this tomorrow at 10 a.m., for example, and it's a 1-hour session, then you can set up the rule to kick off at the start of the hour, mask everything except for the time off and leave balance, and at the end of that hour, revert those changes back, meaning that Maria, won't have any impact outside of that training session on her standard use of a non-production tenant, as well as giving you the ability to perform significant masking at the click of a button. Those are two things I really wanted to showcase in terms of our ability to help you when it comes to masking the data of what it provides over and above what we have within Workday itself, and how actually it offers a real viable alternative to what Workday Scrambling can do. One last thing I did want to make you aware of, though, is that these don't have to be singular occurrences. And I want to kind of give you an indication of what I mean by that. In reality, you'll have multiple people accessing non-production tenants, possibly at the same time. And that's certainly the case here with Hannah, who's our test lead. Hannah's been asked to do some testing on some changes we'll be making to our compensation review process. It's a user experience test, so we're not going to leverage automation here. What we're going to do instead is get her to validate things from a user perspective. Now, Hannah's not someone who normally has access to compensation type information. So what we want to do is we want to build a rule that's going to ensure that she has access only to the information she needs. And when we build our rules, it's really straightforward. We get to choose if we want to grant access to certain information or we want to restrict access to certain information. In this case, we're going to choose to mask everything with the exception of certain fields. And this allows us to pick the fields we want Smart Shield to essentially unlock. What you'll see here is a field selected that allows us to pick the fields that we want Smart Shield to reveal during the session to Hannah. Anything in green is essentially us saying we're happy with this to be visible. What you'll see though is what I've done here is I've not let the name, photo, or position be unmasked. What I want to have happen here is I want to protect our colleagues by anonymizing who they are, whilst not getting in the way of what Hannah needs to do as part of her testing. And what you'll see here is as she does her testing, Smart Shield is able to take effect as and when it needs to, but not get in the way of the testing itself. So when she proxies to start the testing process off as Alain Dubois, without Smart Shield in place, she will be privy to everything that Alain could see, whether that's his own information or team information as well. In our particular sandbox tenant, the compensation review process has been kicked off to allow her to do her testing. So she's essentially seeing what Alain would see in production. One thing I want you to notice, though, is in the inbox, what we've done is we've masked, remember, everything by default with the exception of certain fields. And we didn't want to unmask the worker's name, photo, or position. What that's led to is the employees that are involved in this particular process to be masked and therefore to be anonymous. But what you'll see as we go through these particular button clicks and user experience tests is we're not getting in the way of anything that Hannah needs to do as part of her testing. All we're doing is we're anonymizing who the people are so that she can do effective end-to-end testing. She can still enter data into these fields where they can still do those calculations as it might need to. She is not having any issue in terms of the testing that she's able to do. What she is able to do, what our team could do as a result, is deliver effective testing without necessarily having access to key and sensitive data throughout that particular session. And that for me is really the beauty of Smart Shield and masking in particular. It allows us to enable people to do their job effectively without necessarily giving them access to sensitive data as would happen normally in a Workday environment. And that's the last thing I wanted to show you on that. Hopefully that gives you an idea around testing, around training, and how we can avoid access to sensitive information such as PII during that particular session. I think, Kristen, we have one last question that we had planned, so I'm going to hand back to you to ask this final question.
Yeah, absolutely. And Phil, that was a great demo there. So here we go with the last one. I know of a couple of companies that send birthday reports out. Workday has the functionality of notifying managers on their homepage. I've always been taught that unless an employee has given permission, no data should be shared. So what are our thoughts? So I'll go ahead and kick this off of what we do is we do share birthdays here internally. We share birthdays from date and month. So we do wish employees happy birthday, our team members happy birthday. But what we see as far as the birthday is just the day and month of that employee's birthday so that we are able to celebrate each other and we are able to go ahead and celebrate those big birthdays for people or celebrate those birthdays for people every year. I will say that's our personal preference of what we do. We have organizations that do not share birthdays at all. They don't share the date and month. That's just their preference. I don't think anyone is really sharing years, but they could be sharing years. We don't really see that. We tend to see month and day. We have other organizations who do share month and day, and we see that on their home pages. So there's not really a right or wrong answer. I'm just giving you my opinion. And Phil, I would love to get your opinion on sharing birthdays and how you guys do it.
Yeah, of course. I think we may actually even have a little poll that we can ask everybody else on the call what they think, because the first thing I would say is I agree with you. This is usually a fairly personal thing from a company perspective. Fun fact about me is my birthday is the 1st of January, so I have a New Year's Day birthday. What that means is I never get any messages from work colleagues because they're usually recovering from the night before. So I would actually love myself to get some birthday messages. So for anybody who maybe knows my email address in this call, I'd love to hear from you on the 1st of January to wish me all the very best. But yes, in Kainos, we do a very similar thing. We want our team to feel that we care about them. And what that means is we are sharing that type of information. But obviously it becomes a personal choice in terms of the organization. I guess if you're sharing the day and the month, it's not quite sharing the full grisly details. Certainly for some of us who were born maybe more years ago than we care to admit, that at least we can still wish someone a happy birthday without necessarily knowing their age. But it'll be interesting to see, Kristen, what the people on the call think in terms of what they do within their organization as well. So hopefully that poll will reveal something to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And enjoy the thoughts there. And what we're seeing so far on the poll is out of the responses we have some that do celebrate birthdays at their company. We also have a few individuals who responded that we give people the option to decide if their birthday is disclosed within the organization. And then we have also an answer of we do not celebrate birthdays right now, but would like to in the future. We have not received any responses of we do not celebrate birthdays, the data is confidential. So that's what we're seeing right now. Right now in the lead is we are actually seeing we celebrate birthdays at our company is in the lead by a few votes. So it looks like of the participants, they agree, Phil, with what we talked about and what our preferences are that we share right now at our organizations. It seems like the individuals on the call agree, and that's what they're doing at their organizations, though some are slightly different.
And I think one last thing, Kristen, there was a question put into the chat from Chris asking about scrambling and whether or not we can actually do it with a sense of logic. One of the challenges when you scramble something and you're very definite about, I want Phil to be known as Tom in this tenant now, is you're actually not doing the anonymization process particularly well because it's very easy to reverse engineer exactly who that person is. So for that reason, Workday are applying an algorithm that should make it much more difficult than that. And we do the very same thing actually when it comes to masking. That's why we've chosen to mask with a series of X's or a series of zeros, because what we're essentially saying is there is data here, but we don't want you to have access to this data. So we're not trying to create a synthetic version of that data or something that maybe somebody could reverse engineer. For me, it's always much better if you're going to go do it down that route to actually make sure that it's very difficult to try to uncover that raw source of data. So Chris, hopefully that answers your question.
All right. Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you for the demonstrations and for all of the items there. And Taryn, would you like to go ahead and talk about the follow-up question we have?
Yes. So thanks everyone for joining. If you would like to learn more about the Kainos data masking tool, please go ahead and fill out this poll, and then we'll know whether to provide more information or contact you. We appreciate everyone for attending today. If you do have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to your ACC, ICSM, or you can email success@intecrowd.com. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.